Welcome in, and thank you so much for joining us for our 50th episode of YCP's virtual monthly series, Refiner's Fire, where Catholic business leaders from diverse industries share professional and spiritual wisdom in just short 30-minute live sessions. In spite of the short length of these segments, we hope that the tips and insights will be extremely powerful for all of us as we strive to work and witness for Christ. Now, the name of our micro interview series, Refiner's Fire, it actually comes from scripture from Malachi chapter 3, verse 2, where we learn that God is like a refiner's fire who seeks to purify us and make us the best that we can be. And at the end of the day, that's the whole point of this series. Through the inspiration and wisdom of these exceptional Catholic leaders, we are challenged to improve in small ways in our professional and spiritual lives. So let's be open to this journey of refinement together so that in everything we do it aiming for that higher standard of excellence that gives glory to God. And for our topic this month, we'll be chatting with Tim Moriarty on the topic Beyond the Lens, Merging Faith and Filmmaking. And Tim is the founder of Castletown Media. So without further ado, Tim, welcome in. We are extremely blessed to have you with us today.
That's great to be here, Derek. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to really dive in, I know there's a lot of young adults that are tuning in and within our YCP atmosphere that are in the film industry or looking to break into the film industry. And I would love to just jump into learn a little bit more about yourself of how you got your foot into the door and how you got to where you are today.
Sure thing. Yeah. It's funny when you meet people engaged in film, whether it's video production work or longer form films. There's a lot of eclectic backgrounds. I think mine was certainly one in that I never thought this is where I would end up. My background was spent time in the seminary, was a Jesuit for 3 years in formation, and was very interested in philosophy and theology and those kind of academic sort of pursuits. And then had a bit of a crisis of faith where after leaving the Jesuits, wasn't exactly sure what to do next. And my had family members that were involved in acting and theater, and there was a way in which a lot of the philosophy stuff I was doing was what I felt was keeping me in my head too much. And so there was a desire to say, well, let's explore some of what are the arts, what is the role of the arts in making up for some of the ways in which I was becoming overly cerebral. So I kind of dove into acting and decided to go in and do an MFA in acting, and spent a couple years training professionally on an equity theater. And then after that, moved to New York and spent time pursuing kind of a career in acting. So worked in some episodic TV shows and some commercials, and found that really, interesting, and really, found the craft of acting to be something really profound and beautiful when it's done well. But became extremely interested on the other side of the camera, sort of the storytelling side. I think one of the through lines between the time in theology, philosophy, the times in the Jesuits, learning about the power of the imagination through St. Ignatius, and then this work in acting was just the power, the transformative power of stories. The fact that Jesus used stories, the fact that stories sort of tap into a layer of reality that move the heart in ways that just an abstract argument can't. And it felt to me there were certain opportunities in New York where I thought, it's really great being an actor. My range was rather small. I'd play like an FBI guy or a lawyer, and it was fine. But I thought, it'd be really interesting to try to reconnect with those deeper theological stories that captivated me, definitely in my teens and 20s, and bring that forward and do it at a really high production value. So that was sort of the impetus for Castletown, was this desire to merge kind of these two interests that felt at the time very disparate and apart. And it was through kind of the connections and relationships that I had sort of in New York, where I knew people who were really understood the visual side of storytelling. So, I never trained in terms of working as a DP, for instance. I was always able to find the people that could do that type of work and then bring the particular interest that I had in the storytelling. So that was sort of a little bit of the background of how I got into it. And then that was about 2018, and it kind of grew from there. But that was a little bit of just sort of how I fell into something that really I never thought would be what my life's work would be.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing, and I'm curious too with kind of growing, creating Castletown, and understanding of this idea of being able to merge faith and filmmaking. Was there Was there any resistance or adversity you had kind of fought through or faced, over the course of the last 6 or 7 years as you've been building this and merging, a love for the faith and also a love for filmmaking?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like there's been there the opportunities have come in very subtle ways where it's almost as if a door opens and you walk through that door and you're now in a new space. But the resistance has been really strong as well. I think for me, some of the key resistance has been um, there's been trying to bring faith to visual storytelling, film, but there's also been building a business. There's also been somewhat of this resistance to how do you know, as a Jesuit, as somebody that was wanting to pursue religious life, there was a way in which I wanted this life of poverty, wanted to not have to worry about the financial side of life, and there was, I think, on some level, a sense of business is dirty, just in deep in my own subconscious. So there was a resistance to building a business, um, and making money. That was a huge resistance on my end, and I think a lot of people who, you know, practice the faith. There is that relationship. Okay, what is our relationship to money? How do we? We're not all called to religious life. We're not all called to like the evangelical councils. So what is like a proper relationship to money where we need to make money? You have employees, and I've got employees that have 5 kids. They need money. So that there's been resistance and kind of like a sort of working that out. So that's one area. And then the other one has been um, how do we bring a higher type of production value to the stories we're telling? I think in the past there was a way in which Catholic stories, you could kind of tell uh, that they were done cheaply, just given the visual elements, but also just even the storytelling. There was something almost cliche about the way they were told.
Mhm.
And so there was a desire to try to say, how do we actually elevate that? I mean, if we're telling stories that are reflecting, truth, goodness, and beauty, we have to pull out all the stops and do it in such a way that we're not compromising that story. So there's resistance in trying to understand, okay, how do you do that in a way that doesn't break the bank? What are the partners that you engage with to do that? Um, so there's been a number of challenges, but it's always been, for me, there's always been this sense of I don't quite understand the path, but there's always, it's like that St. John Henry Newman poem, "Lead kindly light, just one step enough for me." There's always this sense that I know what the next step is, and then there's fears and all sorts of questions on the macro, sort of what is 5 years going to look like. But there's always that. It's all like, I think that God has always been opening the door that needs to be opened right at the moment, and just trusting that that's going to continually happen has been a real grace.
Yeah, I love that. There was so much beauty in just what you shared there in the sense of one, I think understanding without doing it just cheaply, but with the right partners and being able to bring out the truth, goodness, and beauty of our faith in filmmaking. And then I think one of the first things that came to mind for me was one of our core values, even at YCP, of just excellence always, like striving to do
Yeah.
excellence for the Lord, because anybody could do anything, at just an average level, but really striving to say, like, the Lord called me to do this with excellence because He gave me the gifts and talents, and that He's going to open the doors for me as well. And then even you mentioning that you may not always understand the path, but the next step. And I think that's really cool as well. And, as we
Hmm.
kind of segue into jumping more into some of the projects that you've been working on, of, in those moments where you haven't really been able to see, maybe quite the light at the end of the tunnel, but you knew this is where the Lord was guiding you. Was there, you know, obviously, there's sometimes fear associated with that, but was there ever a kind of a balance of struggle of understanding, like, hey, I know the next step. I may not know the partner that He's going to get involved with this, or really what's going to
Hmm.
come, but I know that He's asked me just to take this next step and trusting in that. Has there been kind of
Yeah.
a delicate dance with that for you in your journey?
100%. I mean, I think that in so many ways, the journey for me has been to trust. I mean, I've always loved the phrase of St. Paul that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. For me, that's been the for me, building the business and all of this. There's been a tremendous amount of fear, um, and I think that what I've been taught in all this is that, and God has continually been teaching me, is that He always shows up. There's always these situations that seem difficult, whether it's a creative piece where there seems like an impasse where we're not sure. there's always something that emerges. So it's that sense of trust when you take a bold step and try something, and you put yourself out there, and you do so because you feel like you're being called. God is going to show up, and that to me has been true time and time again. And so it's always that it's a kind of dance between the fear that wants to recoil and say, is this the one time the rug's going to get pulled out from under me and I'm going to fall on my face? But it hasn't happened. So, and there's been setbacks and there's been all sorts of things. But I think for me, it's been that growing trust that if God is behind the work, and you can miss, like I've made all sorts of mistakes in interpreting what I thought God wanted. I mean, I think God works through inspiration, but we can make all sorts of mistakes in understanding what that means in the concrete. But that fundamental sense of being drawn towards something has never left me, and that continual presence where He shows up and opens a door when a door needs to be opened has been incredibly beautiful, and it's sort of a practical application of faith. Faith isn't just in the spiritual realm, but in the world that we are living in. That's what faith looks like.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Before diving into some of your projects, just wanted to quick reminder for all of our listeners, we will soon be taking questions from Tim live. So please be thinking of your questions, and you could post them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of this episode. And kind of just segueing into some of these projects and, kind of getting a sense of where you started your career and how you got to this point. Would you be open just to kind of sharing some of the things you've worked on, what your kind of prayer and discernment process has looked like as well, to understanding what the Lord really wanted you to work on, what partners were getting involved and how that looked like, and even your Sacramento life during that time? Because, I think that's such an important piece as well to, obviously going through that prayer and discernment process to understand, like, how can I keep the Lord front and center of this? So could you dive into some of the projects you've been working on over the last couple of years?
Yeah. So Castletown got started in kind of longer form documentaries. The first one we did was about a chaplain in the Vietnam War, Father Capodanno. And it was a story that really just came to us out of working in New York, and it was really through that film, which we just produced at a very low budget. Really, it was just kind of the first film that we just felt like this story needed to be told. All sorts of relationships kind of developed. A key one for us over the years has been the Knights of Columbus. I think the first film that got sort of larger attention was a film that we had produced for the Knights of Columbus about Mother Teresa. It was called Mother Teresa, No Greater Love. And the Knights of Columbus produced that for the Missionaries of Charity. And that was one where we took to theaters, and it became the highest grossing faith-based documentary at the box office that year. And it was also through that film that we met and became very close friends with Jim Wahlberg, who was an executive producer on that film. That was one where we started to see the possibilities, where I think for a lot of years, there was a sense of the mainstream, and then there was like faith-based content. And we started to see with that film that there was a real hunger out there for just telling beautiful Catholic stories, and there was a market for that. Through that relationship with Jim came Jesus Thirst, the Miracle of the Eucharist. This was a film produced by Spirit-Filled Hearts out of the Orange County. And they had a relationship with Jim Wahlberg, and there was a desire there to tell the story of the Eucharist. And the hope was to have it finished and complete in time for the Eucharistic Congress. And what was unique was that we really only had a year to do that film, and it was daunting in the sense of how do you do a film about the Eucharist? It's a theological reality, but it doesn't have it's not like a biography of a hero, of a person in history. It's not even a current event. It's more real than real, and yet it lives in a kind of theological plane of reality. So how do you do that? And that was really just an amazing challenge, which resulted in just a lot of just grace, and we kind of decided to start. The narrative was, how do we lose faith in the Eucharist? What's happened as a culture where so few people, that Pew Research study, and then to sort of trace the story of what has happened to our faith in the Eucharist, and then to explore, okay, what does the Bible say about the Eucharist? And then where do we see experiences, or where do we see glimpses in today's world of people being transformed by the Eucharist. So we would weave together stories of different religious communities or individuals being utterly transformed. So that it was one of those films where at the beginning it felt like this is too big of a task. I don't know how we're going to do this in such a short amount of time, but I think it was a film where again, just the doors open when they needed to, and partners came when we needed them. And that this past year, 2024, again was the highest grossing faith-based film. It did, was Fathom Events as a distributor. That was their most successful Catholic film of all time. And so it was really, kind of an amazing experience. And now the one we're working on now is about Carlo Acutis, which we're going to release in theaters on his canonization date, Carlo Acutis, Roadmap to Reality. And we can talk more about that, but just in terms of the specifics about that film. But to your question about, sacramental life, for me, these films have been really healing. There was a period after leaving religious life where I felt somewhat estranged from the church. I left for a while and explored things like Zen, explored, Jungian, Carl Jung's psychology, and felt a sense of, there was a way in which I thought I had this vocation to the priesthood, and there was some pain involved in leaving that. And then I thought, well, let's see what's out there. And for me, it was really coming back like St. Peter, like, where else are we to go? You have the words of eternal life. And it's really been a very powerful reversion of having been away from the faith to just come back and just with such gratitude for the beauty of our faith, of how much I need Christ in my life, and in doing this work, how important it is to have the eyes of Christ, both from the storytelling. Like, if storytelling in a way is revealing some aspect of reality, you're trying to, open up the veil and ask people to look. You can't do that very well if your eyes aren't clear and you're not practicing the faith, and if you're doing it for ulterior motives. So for me, frequent reception of the sacraments and Eucharistic adoration and confession, and being really sensitive to how subtle darkness can work in your own heart, even if you're doing something quote unquote for the Lord. There can be ways in which the ego wants to get in there. It's really subtle. So I think it's incredibly important to for me to be connected to the vine, because there's so many people. What does Jesus say? Not all those who say Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom. And there's a lot of people out there who are in the faith, quote unquote, faith-based space who subtly, and C.S. Lewis talks about how darkness can work. It's just one step, it's very subtle where you sort of lose your ground. And so I've been very trying to be sensitive to that. And I think the best way to avoid that creep where you just lose the ground, which is Christ, is through the sacraments and through, spiritual direction and all of that. Especially in this particular industry, this sort of film or entertainment industry, it's extremely important to remain grounded, because the ego is just absolutely all over this place. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's just a little bit on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing, because I have to imagine just the absolute necessity for keeping Christ at the center, and also making sure that your spiritual cup is always full from, the conception of an idea all the way through filming and beyond as well, to kind of keep yourself grounded and recognize who is at the center of this. So I do appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, I think creativity is like, it's participating in God's creativity, really. And I think when you attach yourself to it and start to think, oh, that was my idea, then you start to be in a weird spot, so I think it's vital. So I think it's the right question to ask too. Like, what's the your sacramental life and prayer life like when you're engaged in this kind of work?
Absolutely. And I know we have a bunch of audience questions coming in now, but before we get into those, I would love for you just to break down a little bit more, just because the Carlo Acutis movie is coming up here soon in April. Would love for you just to kind of talk a little bit more about how that process has been for you, what you're most excited about, what us as, viewers should be excited about, and just rundown.
Well, I mean, it's incredible, this film, for a number of reasons. I think we're doing it in partnership with the National Eucharistic Revival. So they are a sponsor of the film, along with the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. And one of the things that we thought was extremely important in this film was to basically do what Carlo did. So it's not just, let's just not talk about Carlo, but let's look at the world through the eyes of Carlo. And specifically, let's look at the digital world that we're in. What is this digital world? Questions about, I mean, the name of the film is Carlo Acuta's Roadmap to Reality. And the meaning of that is there is a way in which the world that we're living in, which is increasingly lived through our devices, is separating us from the real. Is we're living in a kind of virtual form of existence. And in many of the folks that we interviewed, from his family, his mother, to different biographers, have said that Carlo is a saint for our times because of the ways in which he teaches us how to virtuously use technology. He approached technology with moderation, and he used his, he did a website on Eucharistic miracles. He did other websites on different spiritual matters, and the goal was not for him to become like an influencer. It was to get people. Chris Stefanik, who we interview, says it quite well. His goal was to get people offline. He was online to get people offline, to get them back connected to Christ in the Eucharist, to concrete friendships, face-to-face encounters. And so in this film, we do a couple things. One is we look at Carlo's life. The other thing that we do is we look at the rise of technology all the way back from the rise of the modern world to a conception of technology as divorced from contemplation, the rise of the internet, and even what's happening now with transhumanist movements. And the through line of the whole film is we track the pilgrimage of a group of young people who go to visit, they go to Rome, and then the culmination of their visit is the visit to Carlo's tomb. And they spend 2 weeks without their devices. And we see them at the beginning where they're on their screens for 8 hours a day. And many of them are unsure. Some of them are raised Catholics, but they say the faith doesn't feel real to them. And we track this journey, kind of walking in Carlo's footsteps, seeing Eucharistic miracle sites, learning about Carlo as they go. And we try to use that as the through line of the film, as this kind of metaphor of this pilgrimage to the real. How do we get in touch with the real? And Carlo, his whole life is pointing us to the real, and reality itself is present in the Eucharist. So it's a film we're going to be releasing on its canonization date in theaters all over the country, and we hope it's going to touch people. It's going to be really something that I think is pointing towards the key issues of our day. I mean, you see the rise of AI, you see the rise of this transhumanism. How is Carlo? Monsignor Landry, who runs the Pontifical Mission Societies, he says he thinks what Carlo is going to do for this century what Saint Therese of Lisieux did for the last century. And this is really a remarkable statement. So, we can't wait to share it with everyone. I should also mention that Jesus Thirsts, the last film, is now available on streaming as well. So that's something else just to plug. But yeah, no, I think the work that you're doing, Young Catholic Professionals, resonates a lot with some of the themes that we're exploring in the Carlo film. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing as well, Tim. And I know myself and everybody listening is super excited to go check it out once it's in theaters. But I know I could probably go on for a couple more hours, but I definitely want to give our audience some time to ask you some questions as well. So let's dive into some questions from the audience.
Cool.
So from Elaine, to you, what is a recent, in the past 10 years, secular film with great Catholic overtones?
That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to know what a secular film is. So, like, it's Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life is technically, it wasn't branded as a faith-based film. One of the things I think is interesting is that I think the demarcations between the secular, the mainstream, and faith-based is in a way kind of dissolving right before us. You see, Martin Scorsese on Fox is doing a series on the saints. You see some of the work that Mark Wahlberg has done with Father Stu. Now, these are those are mainstream, but they are bringing in the greatest stories ever told. Which the greatest story ever told is Christ. Some of the greatest stories are his saints. So I think I was very moved by Hidden Life. I think that is a secular film, but it really, I think it reveals something of the transcendent and reveals something of what is a love that transcends anything that the world can know. There's beauty, I think, in that film. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time for you know for films. Just given the fact that these old lines are really falling apart, and there's a great, I think, new openness to faith in ways that are kind of unprecedented, at least since in the rise of modernity. The faith has been thrown into the subjective. This is just go off and do your thing, but don't let it affect the rest of reality. Well, that's sort of no longer the case. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something that I'm excited about.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Elaine. From Jaron, so question for Tim. What do you think audiences and the culture now are really longing for now that Catholic filmmakers and producers can help bring to the table?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that I think everybody is, St. Augustine's line that, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. I think that we live in a culture that we've gone through the whole new atheist movement. We've lived through the whole death of God, and what we're left with is an age of anxiety. What is it? 42% of young people report persistent feelings of depression. I mean, that's insane. That's more than just like a biological or medical issue. There's a crisis of meaning. So what is it that people are looking for? I think that the heart is longing for the transcendent, is longing to rest on a ground that is beyond just material causality. So stories, I think they're longing for stories that give evidence of that. And it doesn't necessarily need to be even explicitly Catholic. It could be something rooted in the Catholic worldview, within the Catholic horizon, that basically, pierces that false veil of materialism and kind of hopelessness and says, wait a second, we may be standing on a ground that is not just pure stuff or matter. There's something that maybe love actually has a substantial reality that transcends death. I think that's the excitement. Where how do we tell those stories that wake people up to the fundamentals about what it is to be a human being and a human destiny, which is what our faith teaches us. So I feel like the culture is so open to that because there is utter fatigue with all of the other kind of false ideologies that have been kind of given to us over the last few centuries.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Jaron. It looks like we have time for one more question here. So from Alexandra, what inspired you to make the Catholic films? I am a film actor and have done other films as well. How did you get involved with the Catholic films?
Yeah, so I think we got involved with Catholic films really because of these were stories that needed to be told. There were partners of ours that, in conversation with them, it felt like the right time to tell those stories. So again, like Mother Teresa, for instance, it was the Missionaries of Charity that came to the Knights of Columbus to tell that story. And we were fortunate enough to be involved as the production company. With the story on the Eucharist, it was similar. There was a desire, there was a need, there was a recognition that this great reality of our faith has been forgotten. How do we tell that story? So for me, I think there's, if you're an actor, you're involved in the industry, I think it's better to say, you know what, let's do Catholic stories. Let's do other stories that are informed by my Catholic faith. Let's tell stories that are in harmony with truth, goodness, and beauty, and it could be that in your own professional life, you do an explicitly Catholic story about a saint, and maybe the next story you do or you're involved in isn't necessarily explicitly Catholic, but when you read that script, there's something in it that is revealing that the transcendentals, and that's a story that you can get behind. I think it's really important that we stop doing garbage. I think that's important. As an actor, even in New York, I do some of these TV shows, and they weren't explicitly bad or immoral, but they were just kind of stupid, to be honest. They were just kind of banal, and it was like, what am I doing? I think it takes a little courage to say, I don't necessarily want to spend my life doing a stupid story, even though it's paying a lot, that has just that the horizon of which is closed off to the transcendent. So I think storytellers, actors, directors, writers, I think it's really important that we just we tell stories that lift people up, that reveal the beauties of our faith, and don't feel, this sort of inferiority complex where, oh, well, we got to get to the mainstream. Once we're going to do a mainstream, that's all dissolving anyway. So I think it's a time to be courageous, because the world is absolutely starving for it, and I think extremely open to it, which is a sign of real hope.
Amazing. Thanks again for the questions, everybody. And Tim, I appreciate all the beautiful answers you've given today, and really just thankful for your time and just also your witness in a industry that can be very secular, and for really just bringing our Catholic faith into the light with all the beautiful projects you're doing. So I thank you for all the amazing work you're doing in our faith and in the workforce, and everything you're doing to help pave the way for us that are also trying to follow in those footsteps. So thank you for your time today.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really just a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Awesome.